Welcome back to our Director's Chair, our weekly live stream forum, here where we explore the intersection of leadership and creativity and the sometimes more dramatic tools that can help us in leading creatively. And as we have explored this intersection, looking at cultivating a more creative mindset in ourselves, we've looked at how leaders can sharpen their creative edge and fulfill our responsibility of helping out the creative energy of our teams and employing creative activities to achieve innovative outcomes. And a common anchor and focus of exploration in many of our discussions has been the traits of highly creative leaders that they have inherently or have actively worked to cultivate in themselves and others. We've looked at the traits of curiosity, optimism, courage and resilience, inclusivity, creating a safe place to explore and create, and comfort with tension, and the importance of leveraging this in the creative process as well. And corresponding with tension, also the relationship between stress and creativity and the effect the former can have on the latter, which I think we'll touch on a little bit today as well. But one of the most important traits that we found ourselves coming back to has been empathy, and empathy's relationship to leadership and creative outcomes and culture. And as with any ability or gift, this will come more easily to some than others, and we will not all be equally equipped, perhaps with a natural tendency to employ this human trait. But first, so today we're going to dig in, we're going to focus on the singular trait and talk about it in a little bit more detail. But first, we'll take a moment to revisit its importance to the creative process, and then we'll explore here as a group the question of whether or not empathy can be actively cultivated, and if so, how. So I'll open it up here, and I'm going to kick things over to our resident behavioral psychologist, Miss Laura Musgrave. Laura, can you get us started out here? And let's talk about the connection between empathy and creative leadership. And so broadly here, let's dig in and let's respond to this notion of what's empathy got to do with creativity at all, and what is the connection there?
Yeah, great question, Dan. So I think let's set the tone a little bit. Let's just talk about what empathy is and how it's a little bit different than other traits. So when you think about empathy, there's actually two types of empathy, right? There's cognitive empathy, and then there's emotional empathy. And so cognitive empathy is what you can also refer to as like perspective taking. So cognitive empathy is what you think of when you think of putting yourself in someone else's shoes. So it's a very important leadership skill, right? Because it is the ability to cognitively, right? So through conscious thought process, be able to understand what someone is going through. Whereas emotional empathy is when you can actually really kind of feel what someone is feeling. And it's more related to affect, which is your emotional response to someone else. And so when it comes to empathy as a skill or as a character trait, it actually, one of the things that it just kind of inherently cultivates is creativity. And part of that is because when you have the ability to be empathic, and to show empathy, so when you can put yourself in someone else's shoes, when you can feel what they're feeling, then you can do things like negotiate and understand their experience and work through conflict and all of these other skills that are important ingredients to creativity, right? Especially like problem solving, those types of things, creative solution finding. And so empathy is really important in leadership and in cultivating creativity, because it allows someone to have their own perspective, but to also share the perspective of others. And so it's that kind of diverse, like melding of the minds that empathy is a key ingredient for, and an impetus in creating creative solutions or just creative products, right? So really important. It's different than compassion, right? Because compassion is more closely related to sympathy, and sympathy is pity, which is not necessarily what you always want to have, right? Like no one wants to be pitied. But so compassion is more contextual. It's more something that is, you feel sympathetic pity towards someone for their misfortune or a trouble that they're going through. Whereas empathy is the ability to just understand what they're experiencing.
Maybe often in the creative process, creativity is by definition bringing something new into existence, right? And oftentimes we're doing that for the benefit of someone else, maybe the end customer, the end user, for example. So we need to kind of understand where they are, what their needs are, what they think they need, maybe what they need and that they don't know that they need. But our ability to put ourselves in their shoes, to your point, is just absolutely critical. Brian, Tom, any thoughts on there before we plow ahead here? On the connection between empathy and creativity.
Well, connection between empathy, creativity, and leadership. I don't know how people can lead without empathy. I don't know how people can understand. For example, if you're building new products, as Laura pointed out, if you are leading a team, if you're communicating with an audience, I don't know how that you can lead without extreme empathy. And I'll give you an example. Many years ago, I was watching a peer who had just taken over a division, and there was private equity ownership. So what happens oftentimes with people in an audience, they may decide to just speak to their boss without thinking about the other 1,000 or 2,000 or whatever size your audience is. In this case, because this particular leader lacked empathy perhaps at that moment, he was speaking to his boss. He had a business that was flying. It was a sales team. And he said, "We are a parsimonious organization." Well, I watched all the sales people Google parsimony. And what it says is, parsimony is we are unwilling to invest resources and invest into the business.
So, you saw some faces drop, I imagine.
So my point is, you have to have empathy to build products. You have to have empathy to build a team. You have to understand your audience, if it's an audience of one or an audience of 3,000, or if you're an actor or producer, could be an audience of tens of millions. You have to understand what your audience is thinking and thinking. So I don't know how you can lead without empathy, to Laura's point.
Yeah.
To piggyback off that, I think at the end of the day, empathy is what allows leaders, or anyone for that matter, it creates those bonds of trust, right? Without that empathy, you can't have that trust. It gives us, as a, if you're in that leadership position, it gives you insights into what others might be feeling, what they might be thinking, helps us understand how or why they might, react to a certain situation or action. And it really just sharpens that people acumen that really informs the decisions that we make. And so, without this empathy, there's no way that we can build that trust with our teams.
Yeah, that's a very good point. It's just I think it's an important one to underscore too, Tom. Like that trust is the basis, forms the basis for any relationship, right? And you can't lead without relationships. If people are not going to have no trust is going to be developed or sustained without the belief that you care for them. And you have to have empathy in order to do that.
And this notion that Tom is bringing up, this issue of trust. Let's take actors and actors. We always know when an actor is giving an authentic or real performance. One example in recent history would be Christina Applegate's performance in a show called Dead to Me. It's one of the best performances I've ever seen. If there was an Oscar to be given to television, it should go to her, because I trust her performance to such an extent. She the empathy, the sympathy, all of that wrapped up. That's leadership. She owns that character. She's built trust with that audience because it's so authentic. And without empathy, how can you, to Tom's point, how can you build trust?
Yeah, that's a very good point. Good. Well, I couldn't agree more with these points here, but I wonder if, and maybe, I think, Brian, there might be a way. I'm very curious to explore the stage as maybe a way to do this. But first, the question of whether or not empathy can be actively cultivated. I mean, some of us are more given to doing this or being more empathic, Laura, to your point. And I think there's maybe even a difference. And Laura, you'd probably be better able to speak to this than many of us, but between being empathic and having empathy. I think those are probably two different things too. But even for those of us who are not empathic, and maybe we can talk about that for a minute, are there ways that we can condition ourselves to be more empathetic leaders as well? And so let me open it up there. Can you maybe speak to us about sort of the difference between having empathy and being empathic as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So one interesting thing, and I learned this relatively recently, probably the last 5 years, because I always consider myself an empath, right? Like, it's actually why I transitioned out of clinical counseling psychology, because I was like, I'm too much of an empath. I just, my emotional empathy was just through the roof. I just felt everyone's pain and it was just too much.
It's very raw for you.
Yeah. It just, it's hard to check at the door because you just spend all day like, talking to people about their suffering. But I think, a really important lesson for me, and this goes along with the cognitive empathy, which is more the type of empathy that is more easily cultivated. So we can get into that. But one thing that I had to learn and cultivate in myself is that empathy is meeting someone exactly where they are. So let me give you an example. Someone close to you interviews for a job that they really want, and they get all the way through the process. They get to the point where they think they're going to get the offer, right? And they're in a good place. They have a job, so it's okay if they don't get it, but they really want this opportunity and they don't get it. Empathy is the ability to understand why that person is so disappointed. They probably have, maybe they feel a little bit of a loss of confidence in their ability. Maybe they're now not even excited about their current role. So cognitive empathy is the ability to see that and to also understand from your objective perspective, it's okay. Like, you have a job, there will be more opportunities. But empathy is not saying that. Empathy is just saying, I know, like, I am so sorry you didn't get the job. I understand how disappointed you are. I understand how upset you are. So an important aspect of empathy is not saying things like, it's okay, you're going to get another job, or you have a great job. Or think about, when someone's going through a breakup or a divorce, and what is one of the most condescending, non-empathic things you can say? You're better off without him or her. You'll be fine. There are other fish in the sea. Like, we have so many expressions that we say to make people feel better, but that's not empathy. Empathy is only meeting someone where they are and having the cognitive ability to understand, like, I know this will get better for this person, but that's not what they need to hear right now. They need to hear that, yeah, I validate you. This is not great. Like, I'm sorry you feel X, Y, and Z about this situation.
So,
and
Lord,
that's an important distinction.
So that distinction here, which I think is important to underscore, empathy is simply the act of acknowledging and validating someone's feelings, not commiserating necessarily with them, but on a certain level, not feeling their feelings, and actually fully putting yourself in their shoes, which is maybe more difficult to do for some people than others, unless you're used to doing that, perhaps as an actor, Brian, like we've talked about before, and you've conditioned yourself to be able to do that. But simply acknowledging how someone feels, meeting them where they are, that in and of itself, just simply listening to people, can go an incredibly long way, to Tom's point, in building trust. And maybe perhaps, in light of current events, there could not be a more important time to really be practicing empathy as well.
And
that's a very good thing.
I don't know that people can even negotiate with people without empathy.
Right.
Many of us have taken negotiating classes. I remember taking a class in negotiation at the University of Chicago at night. I'm 54. When I was 26, and I still remember, and the instructor was from BU, that's how I remember, because he was so good. And he said, if you don't have empathy in a negotiation, if you're not able to repeat back with sincerity those person's concerns and those issues, you are probably not going to go very far. And that is also true. I mentioned before that I've indirectly and directly hired thousands and thousands of salespeople. And two things: your ability to listen, the ability to be able to speak back to the person in terms of what they just told you, but most importantly, you have to be really comfortable with silence. And silence is a part of listening. So I don't know how there are people who get through life and without setting their empathy free, because we all they're empathy DNA free, but you can't get too far unless you have this at the core.
That's a good point. So can I double click on one of the things you said, Brian? Comfort with silence, which is very difficult for many people. I'll count myself among those. It's been very difficult for me to get comfortable with just silence. Why is that important and part of the process?
It's about listening. For example, I've been married for this coming next week will be 22 years, and I've known my wife for over 30, and so I can naturally I've led teams early on try to solve problems. So when my wife was talking to me, I'll use my wife as an example for any circumstances. And early on, she would say, I'm not asking you to solve my problem.
Mm-hmm.
I'm asking you to listen to me. And that's a form of shutting up, being comfortable with silence and just listening and understanding the problem and the ability to, at the right moment, repeat it back and understand. So that's what I mean. It's one form of comfortable with silence. And then in sales, for example, when customers are thinking, why would you want to interrupt someone when they're thinking? So there's a level of empathy and understanding that moment when someone is concentrating and thinking and trying to make a decision. So why would you interrupt a customer when they're trying to make a decision? You have to be comfortable with.
Allow them the time.
Mm-hmm.
I think Brian brought up some good points, and there's two in there that I kind of want to, there's one that I want to tap on, and then another one I want to bring up. And a big part of listening is just don't interrupt people, right? I think too often people are quick to either dismiss someone's concerns or rush to give them feedback or advice. Like sometimes it's not needed. Just give them their moment, right? Give them their moment to fully communicate. So that's one thing. Second thing is you can learn a lot. I don't know where it comes from, but I heard of like the 93% rule, right? Like 7% is auditory, the other is tone of voice and body posture. And so by really turning everything off, or maybe just there's zero communication, you can look at the body posture of the other individual or the facial expressions, you name it, you get a pretty good idea of how they're feeling. Not only that, but silence gives yourself time to think, right? You should be thinking about, not like where should I next move that chess piece, right? If you're in a negotiation, but it's really trying to understand that other person. So it's not just listening, but it's digesting it, giving yourself time to really understand the perspective, the point of view, and the emotions of that other person.
Silence is powerful, right? You just got to know sometimes when to drop the mic. Imagine, Brian, you probably had more experience with this than most of us, but in negotiating, especially at a high stakes situation, you've got to know when to drop the mic and just let the point sink in and let them work through things. Right. If you keep powering through, you could actually sabotage yourself.
And the thing, to your earlier point, as you started out the live stream with Laura, can empathy be learned, and can it become a habit? And I think the answer is absolutely yes. It does take work, and it does take commitment. There are those of us in the world that are committed to not understanding.
Yeah.
And we see it in the world today with the divisiveness. There's a commitment amongst many to not understand, regardless of where someone is on the spectrum, but there's a commitment there. But if there's another commitment, if you are committed to empathy, committed to understanding, let's take the earlier example of conversation with my wife. Sometimes if I'm not exactly sure what the needs are at that moment, I also have 4 kids, it's okay to say, where you are, what you're feeling right now is really important to me. Can you help me understand what you need right now? And then silence. Don't answer the question for her or him. Just say, do you need this? To say, just help me understand what you need right now, and then shut up. That's being comfortable with silence.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Brian. Let's follow that transition now at this point and talk about whether or not. And I think Brian's made a good case here, which I believe that whether or not empathy can be cultivated, and if so, how. And I think, Laura, I want to just distinguish here between a couple of different things. Like one, you've got empathy, which is just simply understanding, not necessarily putting yourself fully in someone's shoes, but just simply listening and understanding, acknowledging, and validating. Mm-hmm. And that may be more easily done, perhaps, than actually being more empathic and actually more fully experiencing someone else's emotion, which can be helpful too in employing emotion as a leader, being able to fully channel and put yourself fully in someone else's shoes, not just acknowledging where they are, but feeling where they are. I imagine those are two very different things, and maybe one is more easily done than the other, arguably, I'm not sure. But let's talk about this a little bit. Are there some ways that we can actively cultivate empathy and a more empathic sense, perhaps, in ourselves as well? Let's maybe maybe follow that thread. Laura, do you have any initial reactions there between, again, maybe the difficulty or ease or different ways between cultivating empathy and just the understanding, to Brian's point, and actually being a more empathic person as well, which can also be helpful? Any thoughts there? Let's follow that thread.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, well, I mean, it's interesting, partially thanks to 23andMe, there actually is, we found a gene that seems to be linked to empathy. So there is a genetic component, which is interesting. And also, women tend to be more empathic naturally, which makes sense, right? Because female brain structure is actually neuroanatomically different based on, you know, what skills women tend to have versus what men tend to have. But that said, everyone has the ability to cultivate empathy. And, you know, I mean, you could get really detailed on the research, you know, specifically looking at things like Albert Bandura's social learning theory, right? Which is kind of how someone learns within a social environment through things like modeling behavior, experiencing empathy from others, right? So like if you experience empathy from someone else, you're going to start learning those skills and start to then practice empathy with others. So really important. But I think, you know, if you kind of just strip away all of the research and just look at it at a very kind of base level, the first thing I remember is just, what does everyone want? Everyone wants to be seen, heard, and understood. That is like the basis of human existence and what you need to feel taken care of and to feel fulfilled. And so I think that in any sort of situation, and this is why it's so important in negotiation and conflict resolution, is that you will never get anywhere the second you just say, nope, this is like, you're wrong. This is what I want, you know, or this is what I believe, because you immediately shut the door. So you have to be able to have the empathy to say, you know, maybe I don't agree with this, but I hear you and I see you and I understand your perspective. And that can be learned, but it takes conscious effort. And I think that's where not everyone is always willing to take that effort, because you have to kind of table your own perspective, right? You have to be able to put yourself into someone else's perspective and understand where they're coming from and validate it, especially if you don't agree with it. And I think that's what's challenging, but it can be learned. Absolutely.
A big part of what Laura just said is you have to be willing. And I think that's probably the key. I know for myself, I don't really consider myself very an emotional person, but then I watch certain movies and I get worked up at the end. And that's because 2 hours, I'm completely vested in this character. I get to know them. I understand what they like, their dislikes, their weaknesses, their struggles, what matters to them. It's only 2 hours, right? But I'm completely invested. And we talk about creativity and empathy and characters. But like, I choose to be in the moment and present. And I think too many leaders, there's just too much stuff going on, and this might be, you know, a side track for them potentially. But really, I think, you know, they just need to take that vested interest, and like little things that you can do is just remember people's names, right? Remember important events of them, their spouses, their kids' names. Take that personal interest in people, smile at them in the hallways, acknowledge them, be fully present in those conversations where they're talking about their life, where they're talking about their weekend outside of work, right? So you're you know, it might be only 5 minutes in the hallway, but you're devoted 100% to that individual and learning about them. So I think it's more, sure, I believe for sure there's probably a gene, and some people find it easier than others, but a lot of it's just being willing to, you know, that gene does exist in us no matter who you are, and so it's just choosing to engage with it.
So being willing and being a choice, Tom, to actively seek others' perspectives. And Laura, to your point, this can be done. Maybe the way that we do this, and Thomas, sounds like one way you've done it, is actively put yourself in someone else's shoes, a character's shoes who's going through different experiences that maybe you have not had, or something similar that you have, and just following that and feeling that, maybe through film, just watching a movie and seeing a really good actor's portrayal of a character such that you feel the truth of it, to Brian's point, and can put yourself in that. And that actually helps to soften your heart, maybe. a little bit as
Yeah,
well.
and a lot of it could be just like, hey, you need to identify with that character. And sure, maybe, Gladiator, I identify more with, a Russell Crowe type of character, but I'm just as emotional watching A Walk to Remember with Mandy Moore, right? And so, like, did I see myself in Mandy? Probably not, right? But it's just I'm fully invested in her acting and everything like that. So it just depends on you willing to engage with that emotion.
Yeah. Right.
And if I can add on, can it be learned, and can companies train towards empathy? And the answer is absolutely. And I'll give you just 2 examples. Most people in companies don't love something called role playing. And role playing is an amazingly important teaching tool. And especially when you're talking about salespeople. So there's 2 things here. Role plays are wonderful. And I'm going to give you a company that I think is fabulous at helping to teach and train it.
Mm.
But then there's peer-to-peer learning. As you know, I come from education, and so there has been so many studies on peer-to-peer learning. For example, there was a study out of UC Berkeley that said that the advanced calculus students at UC Berkeley would learn as much from their peers in role plays, if you will, than they did from the instructor. So back to role plays. There's a company called, I forget what they're called, but they wrote books called Crucial Conversations and Crucial Confrontations. One of the biggest issues that we all have is giving people performance feedback. Most people, if they're candid, would say they're not very good at it. And that's because they really don't do it that often, right? Big time performance reviews where it's the feedback can be perceived as negative. So Crucial Conversations is a big part of all of their training. Everything is peer-to-peer. You have one person here who acts as a coach, and other people as an advisor, and then you have the role play between 2 people delivering a message. So my point is, yes, if you are committed to learning, role plays with coaches, peer coaches, can be an unbelievably good way to hone your skills.
Yeah, maybe even I think this maybe gets back to, I think there's got to be a lot of research on this as well. And I admit I've not read up on this, but just empathic sort of interventions, if you will. So experience-based techniques such as, Brian, to your point, role playing in new situations, like medical students, for example, experiencing the experience of being in a wheelchair and just understanding the patient's perspective, that sort of thing, and just kind of putting yourself in someone else's shoes actively as a way to kind of understand that, kind of getting back to even just the importance of and the lessons we can take from the stage, I think, as well. Laura, it seemed like you had a thought there. Did I interrupt you?
Yeah, I mean, so many thoughts. Everyone is just, hitting on such great points. But I think it made me think of one of my classes actually years ago for my master's. We had to choose some sort of sense to take away for an entire day. And so like be blindfolded for a day, or you can't speak for a day, or you don't use an arm for a day or a leg. And so I was living in New York City at the time, and I chose not to use one of my arms, and I chose my right arm because I'm very right-handed. And I remember realizing so quickly how challenging it was to do anything, and New York City is such a mobile city. And, I couldn't put my contacts in. I couldn't cook dinner, just so many things. I couldn't type for the day. Like, I had to tell my manager, like, look, I'm doing this thing for class. But it was so interesting to me because, to both Brian and Tom's points, like, until you really, really understand what someone is going through, you don't have much of an idea. And I think that's such an interesting thing about, kind of that creative perspective, and especially acting and everything. And, I've seen interviews of actors that talk about getting into these really deep roles, right? Like really challenging roles. And sometimes they actually have, psychological side effects of playing these really dark roles because they get so into character. And so, just that 24-hour period of losing, part of my ability and having a better understanding of what, so many people go through, as part of their lives was just really interesting perspective that I never would have had before. And so I think that
it's not something many of us have done.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not something I would have just done on my own, And so I think that that's something that's really powerful in organizations and just leadership in general is, even if you don't take that step to really put yourself in someone's shoes by, eliminating one of your abilities. I think that, trying to interact with people from very different backgrounds is so huge for cultivating empathy, because then you start to understand more about them and where they're coming from. And this kind of goes to Tom's point of, it's the simple things like ask how their weekend was, know when their wedding anniversary is or when their work anniversary is. And so that you can just have those conversations, because the more that you can just interact with people from very diverse perspectives, backgrounds, abilities, all of these things, the more you start to understand where they're coming from.
If I can throw body language into empathy, it'd be interesting to see what you guys think about that. I'll use a sales example and I'll use a medical example. All of us have experienced sales calls, and almost all of us have had conversations or around conversations with surgeons potentially and others who are delivering either ourselves or family members some of the worst news that they can imagine. I'll start with sales. Body language matters so much. And I remember back when I was about 23 years old, there was a competitor. Her name was Sarah Tenney, in fact. Her name was Sarah. I still remember this. And she was so much better. And she was 15 years more experienced than me, but she was amazing. But I remember her sitting outside the door of a customer's office. She was there before me. And I watched her body language, back to empathy and listening. Sometimes you see salespeople have an alpha stance, male or female, and strident and very high self-esteem. Well, Sarah bent over, shoulders down, and she was in listening position. And she was an amazing salespeople and really delivered a great product and everything else. But I just remembered it was so powerful at that moment. And her body language said to customers, I'm listening to you. And because her body language said that, she actually was. And she just took such a humble approach. And it just was so important. Likewise with doctors. I've been in situations, my dad's had some issues, my mom's had some issues, and my mom passed away. And there's two different types. The one doctor who was a surgeon might sit down with you. Just like if you have kids, get at your eye level. They're feeling you, they're talking to you, they're not worried about their next surgery, they're not worried about the next trauma, but they take the extra 60 seconds to sit with you at eye level and explain what's going on. Then the doctors perhaps aren't so good at that. But also medical studies will tell you in terms of malpractice. If the surgeon's trying to do the right thing, but something goes wrong, if they sit down with you and they're authentic and truthful about it and they're listening, the odds of them getting sued go down dramatically. So body language matters so much as well.
Yeah, Brian and Laura, you guys both brought up a great point that I want to touch base on. I think I love taking paradigms, right, and flipping them upside down, right, and so let me just go with me here for a second. And so, when you think about empathy, you think about a leader, you think about that leader trying to be very, empathetic with those that are under them. But what if we switch that paradigm, right, throw it on its head? I think the really great leaders are able to get those below them to empathize with them and the cause. And we talked about last week about really big moonshot things, right? And then Laura, you brought up talking about not having your arm for a day and really, feeling what that's like. And so one of the things that I was able to participate in at business school was this thing called the Aerial Group. And their base was acting, right? And so we had a partner, and we picked a partner to tell a story to. We told that story through, just normally how we would do it, any normal person, right? And then they said, okay, now tell that story without any words. And you're like, all right, well, how do I tell the story all over again? And so you're using your facial expressions. You're looking up in the air. You're really being dramatic. But then when you tell that story, and there's a reason why we told that story, it was something like a very important, impactful moment in your life where it was like a crucible moment, but it helped define you. And so then when we presented to the entire group, we were much more animated. People felt like they were there with you. And for me, it was, jumping out of an airplane, skydiving. And sometimes you just have to take that jump and that leap. And it brought everyone in the room on the edge of their seat, and they were listening, and they were creative and empathizing with the fear that I had. And then at the end of that story, they're like, oh, I'm ready to do this next big thing. There wasn't a thing, right? It was a classroom, but like it just gave them that feeling that we're ready, we're a team. We might not know what's on the other side of that, the fuselage of this plane, but we're in it together. Let's go. And so, like, I think great leaders are able to utilize, that aspect. Sure, I'm not saying they don't need empathy. For sure, they need empathy, but great leaders are also able to inspire that teamwork and that empathy among all members.
Tom, I love what you've done there, and like in flipping this on its head, and just I think you've called out a very, very important point, being that that, as you just said, it's important that we find ways as leaders to cultivate empathy in others too. And if you can do that effectively, you can bring people along on the journey, galvanize them, bring them along to a particular viewpoint. And the way we often do that, and maybe perhaps one of the most important tools, arguably, to do that is storytelling, which we spent a lot of time talking about before. And in doing that effectively, emoting different feelings and drawing those out in others is a really, really effective way to create mass empathy, and kind of get everyone on the same page. That's a very, very, very good point. Thank you.
And to further Tom's point, empathy, especially in organizations, it's often a tone from the top issue. You can teach it. People are watching everything that you do. And so to Tom's point, if you talk to people in a certain way, an empathetic way, you vary your tone and voice and all those different things, other people will begin, within your organization, will begin to mirror that approach in their own unique way. But tone from the top and modeling empathy and everything else that we're saying is just so fundamentally important. And I clearly I'm in the camp that empathy and listening can absolutely be learned if people are committed to the idea of it.
Yeah. Brian, I want to maybe follow it. This is a consistent thread that kind of Tom started us out with on a certain level of storytelling and empathy as well. Now, not everyone will be, will have the hobby or spend the time of actually role playing themselves and putting themselves intentionally in sort of situations where they are physically playing the part of someone else. But I'm very curious, given your background as an actor, your training on the stage, have you found that doing so, and some of us may just do that, once in a while in certain situations where we're called to do that in structured environments, such as a situation like Tom described, or some of us may spend more time actively on the stage is something we really enjoy. But have you found that actually physically putting yourself in the part of someone else on stage has made you a more empathic or more empathetic person overall as well?
Yes, and some directors may have you play both parts. And there's an event at the college level and at the high school level, and it's an acting competition called forensics. And there are different events called dramatic interpretation or humorous interpretation, where you can play the role of 3 or 4 or more characters at a time. So when you put yourself into these different characters, in my case, I did Death of a Salesman, and I played the father, and it was Willie Loman, and his son Biff. When you put yourself in both roles, because they're exchanging that dramatic interplay, it does make you better. It makes you a better listener. It makes you more empathetic actor. So yes, you should put yourself in different roles all the time. I mentioned before, my kids are always like, "Mom, Dad's talking to himself again." Often I'm taking the role of someone I'm talking to and all those things. So yes, you should practice it. You should, without question, experiment with that sort of thing.
No. Good. Laura, I want to take it back to something you mentioned before too, which maybe is very, very, again, important right now, is just actively seeking out conversations with people who are coming from a very different place than you are, very different life experiences, and just simply trying to connect with them. Even just day to day, people we come across with, people we cross paths with on a work-related setting, even to just understand how different world events or what have you and life experiences have impacted their thinking. It just gives us a better sense overall of kind of an awareness of others. I think I would argue, and I think I've found in my own life, just those who I know who are very well traveled, who spent a lot of time in different cultures, seem to be, to me, more empathetic people overall as well, just more generally, not just culturally aware, but just sensitive to others' feelings and proactively think through, how is this going to impact someone else who has maybe a far more different viewpoint than I have as well. I'm curious, have you all seen or experienced similar things in your interactions with others as well? Is travel and frequent interaction with other cultures helpful as a way to cultivate empathy as well?
Yeah, I mean, I would say undoubtedly, because there's extensive research, and I won't get into it too much, but we are, we're kind of socialized and also just the way that we've, kind of cognitively been able to just kind of function as a human species is so related to our schemas, right? And humans categorize things because that's an easy way to make sense of your world. And so when you start to categorize and you start to have kind of an us versus them, when it comes to culture or nationality or all of these different things, how do you break that down? You interact with them, you travel, you expand your worldview. And so I think absolutely, and this is, it's such a buzzword, right now in corporate culture is D&I or DEI, diversity, equality, and inclusion. But why does it matter? And it certainly shouldn't be just for optics. It matters because when you have experiences where you're actually interacting with people from different backgrounds, different cultures, different experiences, you have the ability to empathize with them. You have the ability to get creative, right? Because you, to Brian's point, you defined empathy. I play everyone's roles, or I play multiple people's roles. That ability to put yourself into different people's perspectives and to kind of seamlessly understand all of these, this is the father, this is how he would be thinking and feeling and acting in this situation. This is how the son would be thinking, feeling, and acting in this situation. That ability to do so with people from very different cultures and backgrounds largely comes through interacting with them. And this goes back to, just evidence-based research as far as, how do we kind of break down things like intergroup conflict? How do we increase things like diversity of thought and productivity within an organizational setting? And it absolutely comes down to interacting with people from different backgrounds, learning how they grew up. How do they think? What was their school like? How do they lead? What does leadership mean in their culture or in their personal perspective? So I think it's incredibly important to have those intercultural interactions, intergroup interactions.
Yeah, one thing about travel is that it makes you aware that there's other ways to do things out there, right? Like me growing up in the US is going to be vastly different than someone growing up in Spain or Portugal or, Ecuador, you name it. Does that mean the US culture is right and the Spanish culture is wrong, or the Ecuadorian culture is right and the US? Like, no, it's just a different culture and a different way of doing something. There's no right or wrong, right? And so I can empathize. It's easier to empathize with a culture that's not, right or wrong, right? But I think too often when you come back to the US and there's different perspectives, people start looking at it through categorization. You're left wing, you're right wing, you had this type of upbringing, that, and it's just we become a little bit too preoccupied with categorization, and there's no real right or wrong way to grow up in the US, right? It's different. And so I think by just being able to turn off, these differences, and it's not, right or wrong, it's just a difference. And there's something to be learned from everything. Not everyone has all the answers, nor should they pretend to. And I think traveling is a great way to understand that, right? It makes you understand, oh, there's different ways of doing something. Culture is not right or wrong, it's just a different way of doing something. And if you're able to apply that to the US in a more, defined areas in a workspace, the better off and more empathetic that person will be.
These can be these conversations, like maybe this communication-based empathy, if we can call it that, Laura, like of these conversations, or maybe having some of these conversations, Tom, like you talked about, like while we're traveling, engaging with strangers at a cafe, on the street in Rome, or whatever it is, or maybe more social interactions as well, which we can partake in while we're traveling. But one of the things I love about travel is, Tom, I imagine we probably all experienced this ourselves while we're maybe even traveled alone, which is a highly underrated activity, I think, is that travel could be both social and maybe not so social as well. Just simply putting yourself in another place and observing activity and observing others and observing other cultures can be equally an introverted and highly extroverted activity, which as well.
I think with travel can have an impact on people providing that they're committed and open to what that culture or that community defines as respect. We've all heard and seen the movie about the ugly American, for example. So you can be well traveled and go to 100 countries, but if your view is the American way is the way, then you're not open to those solutions. It doesn't change you. You're committed to your point of view. But if you travel and you're committed to being open, and at the core, as Laura pointed out, at the core of all human need ultimately is respect. And you figure out, and just by asking what's respectful here, how do you do this here? And then it does change you without question if you're committed to being open to it.
But again, it comes back to commitment, Brian, to your point, right? I might draw on this this thread of activities that we can partake in that are very easy to partake in as well, and don't require a whole lot of maybe specific effort, or even activity that requires us to get on stage or participate in very structured activities. Travel, communication-based conversations as well, but maybe another maybe more not so social activity that I've appreciated, and Laura, we've talked about before, has been just simply reading and reading fiction, perhaps, and putting yourself in the shoes of someone else, in a character that you're experiencing, maybe like Tom's point, or even just watching a film that actually allows you and kind of forces you, just in a very inactive sort of way, maybe just naturally do it as we put ourselves in someone else's shoes, and just experience what they're experiencing as well. I think also the activity of, I'm going to even connect this back to stress we talked about last week. I've also read that the activity of simply reading fiction, especially fiction, can help to just kind of reduce stress overall, just help you relax, help you disengage. And it's a really great activity to do specifically before you sleep, and to condition yourself for sleep as well. Brian, do you have a thought there?
Well, I mean, one of the greatest issues, and has been an issue in America for over 400 years, is this issue of race. And one of the reasons we have many of the issues that we have today is this, in many cases, this deep-rooted and even cultural lack of empathy. And back to the original point, empathy can be trained. It also has to be hired for. And we all know what we're talking about. If you're a Caucasian male officer and you are pulling over an African American, for example, you would do well to put yourself at every instance and every time in the mindset of the person you're pulling over. Now, we don't need to go into that in a deep way, but the issue of everything that we have here today is a lack of empathy and truly putting yourself in the position of other people. And that's one of the reasons we are where we are today. I was talking to my wife before I called and said, I'm glad I'm not a criminologist or a politician, because it's a tough problem to solve, but I would start with this issue of empathy and over-rotating it and training it like crazy.
Yeah, I think, Brian, that's a very, very good point. I'm glad you kind of hit it here as we near the end of our time together. What you've done is reestablish in a very salient way the importance of empathy too. I mean, I think it's one to just call out again. Maybe at the very heart of a lot of what we're experiencing as a nation, as a global culture right now, in sort of the national and international global conversation, is a deep-seated, deep-rooted lack of empathy. And so finding ways to actively cultivate that in ourselves, in our teams, and just where we are and what we can do, this is one thing that we can do.
That's right.
And I think it's therefore makes this a much more urgent, in many respects, conversation here as well. But as we're heading toward close here, I might just kind of wrap things up with us and summarize. But Laura, you started us out, and we started talking about, like, in the interests of understanding empathy and then working to actively cultivate, it's important to understand there's a couple different types, right? There's cognitive empathy and emotional empathy. We talked about the importance of empathy overall, which again comes back to Brian's point and the urgency of this conversation right now, and Tom, the point that you made, that trust cannot happen without empathy. People need to be seen, understood, felt, validated as a basic human need, Laura, that you talked about. And without trust, we can't do anything as leaders. And so, Brian, to your point, one cannot lead without extreme empathy. And so it's incredibly important that we work to try to actively cultivate that within ourselves so that we can be effective negotiators, effective salespeople, and everyone is selling at all times. And so that's just absolutely critical. And are there ways that we can do that? Yes, absolutely. There are more active sorts of ways that we can put ourselves in structured situations like Tom, you described. I mean, that sounds like an awesome experience. I wish I'd had something like that, where we're put in a position where we need to tell stories and maybe do that without words, that require us to maybe kind of feel what others are feeling or emote specific thoughts or feelings that maybe others can respond to. And to Tom, to your point, getting others to empathize with us as leaders, to bring them over to a position to help them see things another way, is incredibly important in our leaders at a global scale right now. So flipping that paradigm that you described is I think one of our most salient points from today as well. But there are also very easy things we can do day to day to condition ourselves. Those are communication-based sort of conversations and empathy. Laura, you talked about talking to others from different backgrounds, having deeper conversations. You just be naturally inclined to go a level deeper and peel back the onion in some of our conversations to really understand where people are coming from. It's also just simple activities, more day-to-day sorts of things that we can naturally do in our work and our social time or off work time, is just simply travel, experience other cultures, sit within those cultures, see what respect looks like, to Brian's point, in those cultures, or even just simply the act of reading or watching a film and feeling what someone else is feeling. I've seen several different films that have been promoted of late around specific issues that are very salient right now, that I think which for a second I thought, well, how helpful really is this? But now that I think about it, and like even Netflix, for example, I'll give them a shout out here. It put out a list of movies that they'd recommend right now, most of which are fiction, some historical fiction. Can they be helpful right now? I think yes. We watch those, put ourselves in someone else's shoes. It's just a way that we can, even in our entertainment time, condition ourselves to feel some very relevant things right now and gain some perspective overall as well. So I've enjoyed this time together. Thank you guys. I think this is a very important topic right now, especially now, and it's something that I'm going to take a few things away from and think on as well. Laura, thank you for kicking us off.
Yeah, thank you.
All righty. Well, and thank you all for joining us today. Appreciate your time with us. And just a reminder, we'll have another session here every weekday, every Tuesday to Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern. And we hope to see you back again next Thursday here on the Director's Chair. So until then, watch a film, read a book, do a little traveling, engage in some communication-based empathic conversation, and maybe even get on stage. We'll see you guys next time. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.